Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming everybody can hear me, and hopefully everybody online can hear me as well. Great. So I want to welcome you all this morning to Daily Bread and Extraordinary Celebrations. I love food, I love my church, and I am thrilled that we can bring them together. Since we are in church, I think we should open with I'm going to do a poem prayer. I like to have other people, I find other people write things much better than I can, so I'm perfectly happy to use them. And I think Ralph Waldo Emerson is perfect for springtime. So this is called a spring poem prayer. For flowers that bloom about our feet, for tender grass so fresh, so sweet, for song of bird and hum of bee, for all things fair we hear or see, Father in heaven, we thank thee. For blue of stream and blue of sky, for pleasant shade of branches high, for fragrant air and cooling breeze, for beauty of the blooming trees, Father in heaven, we thank thee. So now I am going to move on to our program today. And we have Sarah Peters-Kernan with here today. And I have to tell you, I'm thrilled to meet her in person. I have done classes with her virtually at the Newberry, and so I'm thrilled to have her here in person. And she is an independent culinary historian and scholar in residence at the Newberry, where I've had the pleasure of taking her classes. She earned her PhD at the Ohio State University. And while there, she discovered that not only she enjoyed eating a wide range of foods, but also thoroughly enjoyed researching history food topics. Nothing like being able to combine your two loves, right? And her research culminated in a dissertation based on the physical examination of manuscript and early print cookeries held in archives throughout the United States and England. Okay, there you go. She knows her stuff. And she's also done bread baking in medieval England and has been published in the journal Food and History. She's also served as editor on the Recipes Project, which if you go to her website, you can learn a little bit more about it. It's very interesting for those of you who enjoy cookery. She moved to Chicago in 2014 and has become an active public historian, and therefore we have her today. She's going to be teaching us a program on daily bread and extraordinary celebrations, food and Christianity in medieval Western Europe, which I think is kind of timely considering today we had food and our version of wine for communion. With that, Sarah, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thank you so much for being here today. Okay, I'll try not to do too much in terms of feedback there. All right. I am absolutely thrilled to be here this morning. I was thrilled when Julie invited me to speak and have this opportunity. As she said, I'm a culinary historian. I teach and write about a variety of historical food topics. And as a shameless plug, since Julie mentioned it already, feel free to visit my website, sarahkernan.com, if you're interested in any of my writing projects, my digital projects. Basically, it's all posted up there. But through my teaching, I've had the joy of exploring many topics which fall at the periphery of my primary research. And today's presentation is one of these areas. I think a lot about the intersection of food and Christianity in the medieval and early modern world, but I haven't really had the chance to delve very much into it until now. So I'm very thankful for that opportunity. As a predominantly Christian culture for several centuries, daily life in medieval Western Europe became closely entwined with religious practices, and food in particular reflected Christian beliefs and actions in both quotidian and extraordinary ways. What, when, and how people ate was partly determined by the liturgical year and the calendar of saints. Personal prayer and sacrifice was reflected by fasting and abstinence from specific foods. And every church celebration, however solemn or however joyous, was demonstrated through and by culinary practices. And there's no way to really delve into every topic related to this today in great detail, but I hope to introduce several ideas to you. So things we're going to be looking at briefly in a more introductory way today. The Mass is a Eucharistic meal, the importance of bread and wine at the medieval table, fasting and abstinence, food and the liturgical year, some specialty Christian foods. I'll focus mostly on waffles and pretzels, and depictions of food and religious art. All right. So I want to spend just a moment describing the Christian landscape in medieval Europe, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on the later Middle Ages. So medieval Europe is a Christian society. There were Jews living in cities throughout Europe. There were Muslims living in Spain and some areas around the Mediterranean in the late Middle Ages. But even that group was being pushed out throughout the 15th century. And so there is a very clear Christian majority, and everyone basically is adhering to these Christian food practices. I'm also going to be focusing on Western Europe, because Eastern Europe and what developed as Orthodoxy through the Byzantine tradition was fraught with a whole other set of religious tensions, not only with Western Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam and what is now the modern Middle East. And the topic of food and religion in Western Europe is complex enough without delving into Eastern Christianity. One major change to keep in mind, although I'm only going to be mentioning it occasionally rather than spending a lot of time on it, is the Protestant Reformation, which happens just after the Middle Ages. I'm going to be focusing on in 1517. And this movement changed so much in Europe, and it's really hard to overstate its impact. It changed the structure of courts and laws throughout Europe. It changed the ways in which people publicly expressed their faith, the way they privately worshiped, and this absolutely connects to food. In some instances, people held on to religious food traditions long after doctrine was changed, and in some instances, people let go of those food traditions before the doctrine was actually changed. One final note about this whole landscape: there are many, many variations in the intersection of food and religion, depending upon the specific and time and place. Local traditions emerged, so too did the influences, whether it was the incorporation or tolerance of other religious food observances, such as Muslims and Jews in various cities. There's a lot of change over time, so I just want to insert that in here as well. So let's start by looking at the Mass as a Eucharistic meal. The Mass was a worship service consisting of two main parts, the Liturgy of the Word and the Liturgy of the Eucharist. And the Liturgy of the Word consisted of biblical readings and a homily. The Liturgy of the Eucharist was so crucial to Christian identity that it really became a defining feature of Christianity, and one very closely related to food. The Eucharist is a remembrance of the Last Supper, a reenactment of the Last Supper, which is the New Testament event in the Bible in which Jesus Christ shares his final meal before dying, and he shares that meal with his 12 apostles. During the Eucharist, bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ, and for medieval Christians, this was not a symbolic transformation, but the substance of the food actually changed into the actual body and blood of Christ. The form was the same, so everything looked the same. It still looked like bread and wine, but the substance was the part that changed. And this transformation was called transubstantiation. After transubstantiation, the clergy would share the transformed body and blood with one another and with the congregation. This entire process of transubstantiation and sharing would take place in the part of the Mass called the Liturgy of the Eucharist. And most medieval Christians only received communion once a year at Easter time. The Eucharist was celebrated at daily Mass, but it was usually just the clergy, the ordained priests, bishops, etc., who would receive regular communion. Transubstantiation was codified at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and after this point, the body and blood of Christ took on an even more important role in worship. Christians could receive communion orally, but also could receive it visually or ocularly. seeing the host or the bread as it was elevated and then transformed into the body of Christ was celebrated and became a really important part of the Mass. And at this point in time, the clergy, the priests who were celebrating Mass, they were facing the altar, and so their back was to everyone else, to the congregation. And elevating the host allowed everyone to partake in this moment of transubstantiation. Artistic representations of this moment at Mass proliferated religious texts of the late Middle Ages, as well as images of the hosts and bread itself. Transubstantiation is a very important aspect of medieval Christianity, and for post-Reformation Christians, this really distinguishes these medieval Christians and now Catholics from other Christians. And while many Protestants continued to celebrate communion, they did not necessarily believe that the food they had shared had become the actual body and blood of Christ. Instead, the change was symbolic. And Catholics did not waver from this belief even long after the Reformation. This is still a Catholic belief today. And I'm not going to dwell on this for a long time or talk much about this, but I have these images up here of pictures of the sacred bleeding host of Dijon. There's a whole category of miracles in the medieval church and even into today in the Catholic Church of Eucharistic miracles, where things happen to consecrated hosts that are miraculous and cannot be explained in any other way, such as this one, a desecrated host that began bleeding the actual blood of Christ. And so a lot of manuscripts from this period actually depict this particular Eucharistic miracle. All right, just to make sure I have enough time, I'm going through everything else. Because this central aspect of medieval Christianity is based on the idea of a meal and sharing food, the Last Supper is a really common religious image during the time, very rich with symbolism and reflective of local practices as well. This particular image on the screen right now, this is at the Art Institute of Chicago. You can go down the street and see it. But up here we have a Last Supper image. I'll zoom in on that. So I'll just go through a few of these here. A couple more different Last Supper images. And then, as I mentioned, sometimes they had some local flavor that were injected into them. And so these next series of images are a little bit after the Middle Ages. These are from the 16th through 18th centuries in Peru and Ecuador. And these Last Supper images actually show cuy, or guinea pig, being part of the Last Supper, which was a food that was regularly consumed in the Andes. And so when the indigenous people of that area were being evangelized by missionaries during the early modern period, the resulting Christian practices had this sort of Last Supper imagery incorporating the cuy, or guinea pig. So there are actually quite a bit of these. I didn't realize how many images. I just thought there were one or two. But over and over again, you have the little guinea pig showing up in here. Yeah, so not going to dwell on that much longer since that's past the Middle Ages anyway. All right, the importance of bread and wine at medieval tables. As the elements of the Eucharist prior to transubstantiation, bread and wine are both constant reminders of Christ's presence in the world, as well as important food staples. The Eucharist was celebrated with unleavened wheaten bread and wine made from grapes. And while generally people consumed leavened bread for sustenance, bread made from wheat and wine from grapes were ubiquitous foodstuffs. And bread and wine were featured countless times, not only in the Bible for their universality and marked a sustenance for all, but the same was true in medieval society. And bread's status, in particular, as a food consumed by all levels of society, marked it as a universal symbol of life and therefore a gift of God. The bread and wine were also foods that were transformed at each Mass into Christ himself, only made them more important. So I want to show a few images of medieval bakers. You can see some very similar baking practices among all these late medieval images. And then winemaking practices. These are very common images, show up very regularly in manuscripts, stained glass, sculptures, the bread and wine imagery, whether it's the making or the consuming, they pop up constantly. Okay, so moving on to the practice of fasting and abstinence. And these were practices which reflected both personal as well as church-mandated sacrifice and prayer. So what exactly am I talking about with fasting and abstinence? Fasting is a complete avoidance of food for a certain period of time. It could be a total fast, or it could be something called a black fast, which was to fast all day and then eat a small meatless meal at night with water. Abstinence, on the other hand, is the avoidance of a certain type of food. In this case, it's from all animal products. So meat, fat of mammals and poultry, eggs, milk, products made from these, like butter and cheese. And these days where you are expected to abstain from meat and animal products were often called fish days. So I might refer to them as that, just because you could eat fish instead of meat on those days, and that was perfectly appropriate. So abstention from foods and fasting had existed in earlier faiths. This was nothing unique to Christians, but what is distinct about it is the animal products that are not allowed and why. Well, so why is this distinct? Christians fasted for many reasons, but most importantly because of obedience. As it was specified in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible to fast, and also for penance. By abstaining from food or certain types of food and giving up part of yourself to God, Christians could reflect on their sins and seek forgiveness. It was also an act of atonement to attempt to repay Christ for his death on our behalf. Fasting and abstinence were both public and private devotional acts. You not only denied yourself food, but usually you did all this in community with those around you, whether it was your monastic house or all the Christians in a certain community. And there are lots of suppositions why animal products were excluded, and these can range from you want to avoid it because of the enjoyment and luxury of meat and animal products, the association of meat with Christ's flesh and blood, and also one other reason that you might hear given is that mammals and poultry were saved on Noah's Ark, but fish and water animals were outside of the ark, so thus they were exempt from rules. So sometimes you hear that one, not always. All right, so when were people expected to fast in the Middle Ages? I'm going to come back to this with more specificity in a few minutes, but roughly a third of the year was spent abstaining from animal products. Fasting was at least 2 days a year, sometimes more, but abstaining from these animal products was much more common in that calendar. And exceptions were gradually made over time because this was a very difficult practice. It was very hard to give up lots of categories of food for a third or more of the year. And these exceptions in the Middle Ages were usually influenced by Thomas Aquinas, who argued in the Summa Theologica that animal classification was based on habitat as much as anatomy. And so you have certain animals creeping into the allowed category, which had not been before. The Benedictine Abbey of Les Trepours in northern France began regularly eating puffins because of their association with water, and they were being considered fish then. This is a porpoise image. Dolphins, porpoises, and whales, they were mammals, but acceptable to eat as mammals of the sea or like fish. The medieval German term for dolphin is actually Meerschwein, or pig of the ocean, while porpoise comes from the Latin for pigfish, Porcus piscis. The tails of beavers, which were scaly like fish, and beavers, since they lived in and around water, the beavers and their tails became allowed foods. And another very odd one, the unborn fetuses of rabbits and newborn rabbits, known as lorises. Those were also allowed. A couple centuries later, once more exploration and missionary activity began in the New World, the rules became even more flexible, especially in these colonized areas and in colonial outposts. So in South America, especially Venezuela, capybara meat was allowed during Lent and Holy Week. Beaver was reiterated as a permissible food for French settlers in Quebec. In southeastern Michigan, muskrat was permitted, and in Louisiana, alligator was permitted. So they all fall in these same strange guidelines, but yeah, they all became allowed at some point. All right, so food and the liturgical year. As I already mentioned, medieval Christians abstained from certain foods at specific points during the liturgical year. Most of the time, Wednesdays and Fridays were fast days, or days you were expected to abstain from meat and animal products. Certain periods of time were also designated as periods of fasting or abstaining from animal products. So Advent and Lent were the most notable of these, with Lent being the most difficult and the longest period. And they were both periods of penance and prayer. And so fasting went hand in hand with these personal devotional activities. And every Christian, whether rich or poor, clergy or laity, had to adhere to these same rules of fasting and abstinence. So this was something that everyone had to perform and experience at the same time. And obviously, people did not like this after a while. It was very difficult. So one comment from a 15th century English schoolboy in his school notebook, I'll just read the modernized version here. "You will not believe how weary I am of fish, and how much I desire that meat were available again. For I've eaten nothing but salt fish this Lent, and it has caused so much phlegm in me that it stops my pipes, and I can neither speak nor breathe." He has a lot of other things to say about different types of fish in this particular notebook, but yeah, I found that a very applicable statement for today's talk. So these fasting practices, this also plays out in cookbooks in all regions of medieval Europe at the time. Recipes were actually most commonly separated by fish days and meat days. And they were not divided up in other categories, like what course you were eating or the main ingredient of the dish. It was simply by what was a meat dish and what was a fish dish. So that's how much this impacted cuisine at the time. Meat dishes, they generally did have fish counterparts, to be clear substitutes. And many other substitutes did become available over time for animal products. So oil was used rather than animal fats like butter and lard. Almond milk was made and used instead of dairy milk, cow's milk. And almond milk cheese was actually made and sometimes available instead of cow's milk and cheese. So there were other options available, and in fact, royal tables, noble tables, they were still incredibly lavish dining experiences, no matter if it was a fish day or a meat day. That really didn't matter. I mean, there were creative chefs, there was a huge staff and a huge budget, and so you could make anything happen regardless of what religious practices you were following. Yeah, speaking of some of the crazy things that they did in these cookbooks, I want to show two quick recipes, well, not quick to make, but dishes for counterfeit eggs. These were meant to be not really joke recipes, but entertaining recipes to serve during a fish day or a period like Lent to bring some levity and enjoyment and pleasure to the table. And so this and the next recipe I'll show, they basically involve creating some sort of egg white and egg yolk and inserting them into an eggshell with the real egg insides blown out. So that it looks like it has an egg white and egg yolk, but it's totally edible. Some of these sound absolutely disgusting, though, and involve like curdled whites. But the point is that sometimes they were willing to go through this sort of process to make an entertaining and creative dish during a period where you are probably really fed up with a lot of the food around you. To further show this, I want to delve into this image that's on the screen right here. There's so much going on in here, so I'm going to break it up into a couple pieces of the painting. But this is an image by Peter Bruegel the Elder, The Battle Between Carnival and Lent. This is a 16th century image. It's a little bit after the Middle Ages, but this really still reflects very nicely the same sorts of things I'm talking about and will continue to talk about for the rest of my presentation. So Lent is this period of fasting. Carnival is right before Lent, and it's a time when you are expected to party and enjoy your food and eat up all those animal products that you're not going to be able to eat during Lent. Use them all up while you have the opportunity. So first I want to take a look at the fasting image, and I'm going to come over here. I hope that's okay with the camera. But we have these allegorical figures. This is one of them representing fasting. And you see how gaunt and thin and pale he looks. He looks like he has not been eating regularly. He looks very tired. He is holding fish. He is surrounded by culinary symbols of fasting. Pretzels, which we will talk about very, very shortly. We have some shells, some mussel shells. So we have the fish, again, represented here. We also have the poor being fed, so almsgiving, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, and that being an important component of Lent. We have some reminders of the sounds you might hear, a penitential sound of medieval Christian Europe, these ratchets. You would turn a crank and you would hear this wooden ratchet noise, and those were used at Mass at certain points. You might hear them in the streets, but we have lots of large fish up here as well. Probably some cabbage in the basket, and someone getting water. And we see only water here, unlike the alcohol we're going to see on the other side of the image. So this is just chock full of all of these images of fasting and Lent. Now, on the other side of the image of painting, we see this allegorical symbol of feasting, of carnival. We have this very plump man here, and he is holding a spit with meats to be roasted, so something that's going to be prohibited during the period of Lent. He is on a barrel of wine or ale, who knows. We see eggshells and bones to reflect these things that he's been consuming, or everyone's been consuming, that is not allowed for anyone on the Lenten side who's fasting. We have a woman who's making waffles up here, and waffles are going to become known as a symbol of feasting and enjoyment, not something you're going to be eating during Lent. We have, well, I guess a lot of the drunkenness is on other parts of the image. There are a lot of people drinking alcohol. There's a person vomiting that you can't see in this portion of the image. We have people gambling, And people are ignoring the poor. They are not giving alms. They're not giving money. They are not giving food. They are not caring for the poor. So a very different scene on this side of the image. And again, chock full of all these culinary images and symbols. So people are very tired of fasting, of these fasting practices. It is very difficult. And so different localities started dealing with this in different ways. In Rouen, France, in the 16th century, there is an entire tower constructed on the cathedral in Rouen called the Butter Tower that was supposedly funded by people who paid for an indulgence to eat butter during fast days. So here I have a picture of the tower, of the cathedral in Rouen, and then a piece of the Butter Tower that's on the Tribune Tower here in Chicago. So a little bit of a Chicago connection there. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, several animal products were permitted in diets during Lent in some areas, but some remnants of this fasting tradition remain today, even with meatless Fridays during Lent for modern Catholics, and the tradition among many Christian denominations of giving something up in general for the period of Lent. All right, but all was not terrible in the Christian calendar, the liturgical year. Not all food traditions were bad. Some were tied up with feasting and enjoyment and pleasure. Many local and regional specialties developed to celebrate these feast days and saint days. The medieval Christian liturgical calendar had many feasts, both major and minor. 2 annual principal feasts were Christmas and Easter. In noble households, feast days were a natural excuse to have a more lavish meal or a feast. And even poorer households might be able to have a better meal, including better bread or a protein on the table on a major feast day. And Christians also celebrated an array of lesser feast days, like saints' days for their patron saint, or a saint who happened to intercede for their city or for their profession, or for an entire kingdom. And so local food practices developed to celebrate some of these saints. One is for Saint Agatha. In Sicily, a tradition developed of making virgin's breasts, or mini Dei Virgini. And Saint Agatha, when she was martyred, she had her breasts cut off, and so you see the full image here, which is actually at the Art Institute, and the close-up of the tray that she's holding with her breasts, and then the actual pastry item that was made in Sicily, and you can still purchase it in Sicily and in some other places today. There's an outer layer of shortbread dough and a filling like cream or custard or preserves. Sometimes there's a layer of almond paste that's added and an outer layer of dough. So this is just one food practice. Another is for St. Lucy, who, again, this companion image, also at the Art Institute. When she was martyred, she had her eyes cut out. And so we see the vessel holding her eyes, and then the counterpart pastry, the Lucicater or St. Lucia buns for the Feast of St. Lucy. And this is predominantly a Swedish pastry item, baked item, and it contains saffron and has raisins or currants or another dried fruit to make these pieces of pastry look like eyes. A couple other ones I'll mention. Zeppoli emerged for the Feast of St. Joseph in March. Walnut tarts for the Feast of St. Andrew in November. And goose in much of Europe for the Feast of St. Martin in November. Okay. Switching a little bit here from these feasting practices to a very important practice of almsgiving, of giving away, particularly giving away food or leftovers from a feast to the poor. Donations to the poor and needy were a significant aspect of medieval Christianity, and the giving of alms was closely tied to penitential activity. And the act would bring you closer to God, it would shorten your time in purgatory, and provide you an opportunity to reflect on your own sinfulness and shortcomings. And in the Middle Ages, this was both a personal and physical aspect of the faith. You did not merely donate money to a cause. You went outside. You directly handed food to the people who were there. You directly handed them food and drink or money to the poor who were outside your household or who were outside in your community. And sometimes money was distributed for food, but often food itself was handed out. And food would be distributed after meals and large feasts where the poor would receive leftovers. And someone from the household, it might be the master or mistress of the household, sometimes a servant, they would distribute the food in a designated place outside the home. Some household accounts from noble families included specific line items for almsgiving, showing bread in particular would be purchased and distributed. Monasteries were a significant source of food for the poor, and they handed out food daily to the needy. And some orders went out into the streets and brought food directly to the poor, while others distributed it right outside their doors. Okay, looking at a couple specific specialty Christian foods here. I want to first look at wafers and waffles. And for those of you here in person today and not on Zoom, you have the pleasure of enjoying a couple food items on the table over there. One of them being waffles, Stroop waffles, and the other one being pretzel bites. And there are reasons for both of those, so you will find out in just a moment. So waffles, they are descended from communion wafers, medieval communion wafers, and a wafer tradition called oublies, which were like a secular version of the communion wafer. Wafers had absolutely been made and enjoyed since at least ancient Greece, but these original wafers were very plain in both taste and decoration. Medieval waffles were thin and crisp, usually highly decorated. They were not fluffy waffles with a grid pattern at this point. And so it is helpful to think of them as wafers rather than waffles when we're talking about these medieval iterations. So wafers, or oublies, were a companion to the communion wafer. And these communion wafers were called oblata hostas, or hosties. And they were originally made with the same ingredients. They looked quite similar, except oublies, or the secular versions, were quite a bit larger than the communion hosts, and both actually incorporated religious designs. Monasteries made wafers for communion throughout the Middle Ages, and they sometimes even sold unconsecrated wafers as fasting food because they did not contain any animal products. Before shifting solely to the oublies and then the waffles, I want to point out this particular image. This is a medieval iron for making hosties, which made 6 hosts at one time. And this one depicts several resurrection motifs, and one is the Lamb of God with the bannered cross staff. Now, oublies were made throughout Europe, and by the 13th century were a commonplace foodstuff that were sold by street vendors, including ones who sold directly outside of churches. And by 1270, the Oubliers Guild was established in Paris. Wafers were originally made using flour and water and would depict biblical scenes, crosses, and other religious icons. They could be very simple in terms of ingredients, but gradually spices and sweeteners crept into these recipes. Spices became part of the recipe in the late Middle Ages, as well as local traditions of flavoring like honey, sugar, and even orange blossom water. And the typical batter also looked more like a cake batter, consisting of flour, water, and milk, and often eggs. And these sweetened flavored wafers made with eggs and fats became associated with feasting and non-fasting days. And these wafer irons were so ornate and decorative that they were often given as gifts, business gifts, wedding gifts. So this is a longer version, so you can see kind of in parallel with what you see in the painting here. Sorry. This one right here is a Burgundian wafer iron, oubli iron, which was likely a wedding gift, as well as this one here. Even though it has the Agnus Dei imagery on one side, it has heraldic images on the other side. So you'd have these double-sided wafers, which had both secular and religious imagery. So where the wafer, or let's see, let me go back. Here we go. A couple recipes. Just want to make sure I have plenty of time here. Couple recipes I want to go through. This one is a 14th century recipe from Le Ménager de Paris, a French book that has a large cookbook section, recipe section. And you see that the recipe involves eggs and some salt and wine, flour, and it gives you instructions on how to actually prepare it, and that you might need some oil or grease. So even by this point, you definitely have a lot of animal products that are being incorporated into this. You would not be able to have it on a fast day. And with this recipe slightly later, you're actually using bread as the basis. You're mixing that with egg yolk, sugar, water and wine, ginger and cinnamon to create a batter for this. However, by the 16th century, we see a real distinction between waffles and oublis, and some wafers began to be known as gaufres or waffles, essentially the modern waffle, and Dutch rectangular waffle irons appear with the grid pattern that we now associate with waffles. And so, let's see, I don't have that circled here, but you can see the lady by the fire. She has a waffle iron, and that is producing thicker and fluffier waffles. She's actually able to insert her knife into it. You would not be able to do that with a thin, crispy, host-like wafer. You can kind of get a sense that these have bigger, more distinct grid patterns, more like a modern waffle. And then here in this image, these certainly look like modern waffles that are right in the center. And this still life is depicting these waffles with a lot of other sweetbreads, a specialty Christmas bread, pancakes, all sorts of things that you would not eat in any sort of fasting situation whatsoever. And because of all this is emerging, especially in the Netherlands, where the wafer initially served as a metaphor for fasting, the waffle really becomes a Protestant symbol of festivity and even luxury. They're made with eggs and cream and other rich ingredients forbidden during fast days. And so waffles, as opposed to wafers, were really prepared only in Protestant countries and regions after their emergence in the 16th century. So thus today you have the stroopwafels or syrup waffles to kind of harken back to this, this whole idea of waffles that we're talking about right now. So you can enjoy that after the class today. Now, pretzels, on the other hand, they're on the other end of the spectrum, very much a fasting food. And we start seeing images of pretzels quite early on. We have this 12th century image, which may be the first image of pretzels. There's some debate about it, but it appears in the Hortus Deliciarum, or Garden of Delights, a 12th century encyclopedia that was written by the abbess of Hohenberg Abbey. And she was from a royal family. She was very well educated. And her incorporation of pretzels in these banquet scenes really, throughout the whole text, there are several banquet scenes that show the pretzels' presence on noble tables, their consumption by nobility, but still, it was a simple bread. It was humble enough to be allowed during Lent, since it did not contain any eggs or dairy. Pretzel dough was rather austere, as delicious as it was and still is. One story attributes its origins to around 610 in northern Italy of southern France, where a monk created pretzels as a reward for his students for learning their prayers. He supposedly created these treats out of baked pieces of leftover dough that were twisted together to resemble crossed arms, a traditional prayer pose. And supposedly he called them pretiola, which is Latin for little rewards. And these pretzels with their 3 holes also represented the Holy Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. However, there's another story, of course, that the name also may have come from an old German word instead, bracciatella, which is derived from the Latin word for arm, brachiatus. So I have lots of pretzel images, which I'm not really going to be able to spend time on, but we see pretzels as a border in this illuminated manuscript. On this page with St. Bartholomew. Other images of bakers in Nuremberg. There are even more images than just this in the same manuscript that show pretzels hanging in the bake shops. And then, of course, from the image of the battle between Carnival and Lent, where we see the pretzels all over the place in here. So during the Middle Ages, there's also a lot of monastic production of food and drink. Nuns in particular are closely associated with pastries and confections, particularly in Italy, Spain, and Portugal. And this really reflects in these particular areas the region's reliance and their association with the sugar trade at the time, and their sugar supplies coming from the Mediterranean area, having very easy access at first. The fruit they were able to grow in their religious houses that was then being made into preserves with the sugar. Yeah, there's some other stories associated with that. You can ask me about that afterwards if we have time. These are just some images. Portuguese tourism sites today still advertise all of these conventual pastries and sweets, all of these foods that are made specifically by nuns and religious houses. It is that entrenched in Portuguese culture still. And this goes all the way back to the 14th and 15th centuries, and this tradition of monastic houses producing sweets. One other that I'll mention, there are plenty of wines and spirits that are closely associated with religious houses and monastic orders. The Carthusian order, they are closely associated with the spirit chartreuse, which comes not only in this yellow and green varietal, but also an elixir végétal de la grande chartreuse, which is more of a medicinal tonic product. And that is one that was given to, the recipe was given to the Carthusian monks of the Monastère de la Grande Chartreuse in 1605, and it was tweaked by the house and is continued to be made today and sold, although there are very limited supplies right now for a number of reasons. But that's just one example of a monastic produced food product. Okay. I am going to cut out some of what I was going to show you in here because there is so much. There are so many depictions of food and culinary practices in religious art of all types, whether it's literature, music, visual art from the Middle Ages. And you've already seen many works of religious art today, including many depictions of the Last Supper. Some other ones I'll just quickly go through here are ones that involve fruit imagery, and fruits are often used because they're symbols of things like virtue and fertility. So on these two images here, you have lots of strawberries being shown. These red berries, in addition to representing virtue and fertility, they also could represent drops of Christ's blood. And the trifoliate leaves of the strawberry were suggestive of the Holy Trinity. And when paired with flowers, as they are here in these books of hours, they represent righteousness. And strawberries are also closely associated with the Virgin Mary in medieval imagery. But other fruits also show up. There are different citrus fruits, different sorts of berries, apples, pears, pomegranates, quinces. All of these different fruits show up regularly. There's of course the association between apples and being associated with the Latin for evil or knowledge. The apple being associated with the tree of knowledge from which Eve ate the forbidden fruit, causing the downfall of man. So we have a lot of fruit imagery that's showing up here, and a lot that can be extracted from these works of visual art. I'm going to skip Canterbury Tales, and I apologize for that, just in case anyone was super excited about potentially hearing about that today, because there's so many different food symbols in the Canterbury Tales. But one that I'm not going to skip over is one that you're probably not quite as familiar with today, and that is a musical example. So the Cantiga de Santa Maria are a series of songs that were composed or maybe edited or overseen by King Alfonso the Wise of Castile and Leon in northwestern Spain in the late 13th century. And this particular cantiga, it is focused on the topic of pilgrimage and how nothing bad will happen to pilgrims because the Virgin Mary is going to be watching over you if you visit this one particular site. And while this group of pilgrims in this cantiga are, they are on this pilgrimage, there is a servant girl who steals some meat from them. And this is obviously a problem. They need to have their meat to eat and have sustenance. And the Virgin Mary, she reveals the meat and herself to everyone there through a miracle by making the meat dance and pound within this box so they can find it. And so we have this song, this cantiga, with a simple melody, a repeated refrain which states the moral of the song over and over. So I'm going to go ahead and play just a moment of this. And I have the text up here. I hope it's large enough that most of you can see it. But really the good part is at the end where the pilgrims, they search throughout the house trying to find it, the pork chop, or the chop, meat chop, calling to Holy Mary that she reveal it to them. And they heard it in a trunk, the chop hitting the side, and they went out running over to it quickly. They were not loitering. And they had the trunk open, they looked inside, they saw their chop jumping back and forth, and they ran into the streets and called to many people who saw that miracle, which was one of the most marvelous, that the glorious Virgin had performed in that place. So they took the chop and hung it on a silken cord in front of her holy altar, praising Holy Mary, who performs beautiful miracles. So really interesting intersection between pilgrimage, Mary, and dancing meat chops here. Yeah. To the end here. They're finding the meat chop now. So. All right, so I'm going to end with that today. There's obviously a lot more I could talk about, and I hope you guys ask questions. But just to wrap it up here, from the bread that was consumed at daily tables, the heavenly bread received at Mass, the foods consumed to celebrate feasts and fasts, and even the depictions of foods and all these different types of artwork, there was no escaping the influence of food and religion on food. So, thank you.
Sarah, that was fabulous. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did. I mean, from waffles to pretzels to Santa Lucia buns. I'm never going to eat one. Look at those, quite the same again. We have about 4 minutes for questions. Does anyone have a question for Sarah? All right.
Was any of the emphasis to foods such as fish given so that the sellers of the fish would earn money, or any kind of linkage of the foods to trade?
Yes, and especially, so the fish industry became very, very important throughout Europe, and because of this reliance on fish for protein for the wealthiest in society especially. And particularly after the Reformation, you start seeing different local governments, particularly those who became Protestant, trying to prop the fish industry back up because people were no longer eating as much fish anymore. And so there are a lot more regulations trying to increase the price of fish or get people to buy more fish, or trying to boost international trade in fish so that their local fishmongers and fishermen could sell internationally. You start seeing that a lot more when you don't have this huge base of people who have to eat fish all the time. So yes.
I couldn't help comparing the thinness of the communion wafers to the thicker development of waffles, and thinking of thin crust versus deep dish and thicker crust pizzas. Partly because I have a friend in Canada who has been traveling and telling me all sorts of food-related stories, and when I said something looked like a name that I recognized of a pizza place, she said, "Oh, well, sorry, but I don't like deep dish pizza." Well, I only recently tried it, and I've lived here for decades. So I'm wondering, in medieval times, is there any evidence that there was sort of a local competition about, we do it thicker and fluffier, and they do it thinner and more religiously?
Not with wafers, no. You see that with other types of bread, absolutely, and other types of pastries, but not with these wafers. That's a pretty standardized texture to expect. The flavorings are going to be different where you go, but it's going to be a thin, crispy wafer wherever you go. Yeah.
Did anybody else have a question? No? Oh.
I know you said you weren't going to cover Orthodox customs in your talk today, but since today is Orthodox Easter,
yes.
I just wondered if if we wanted to go home and celebrate that in some way, do you have any tips on how we might do that?
No, I don't, and I'm sorry. I'll just be honest right up front. I am not the person to ask about that. I'm much more comfortable talking about medieval Western Christianity and not Orthodoxy.
I know about dyeing eggs with onion skins, or boiling them in I was friends with a Serbian woman, and it's kind of fun. So
Yeah, I think you're probably safer speaking to someone who knows a lot more about that than
Okay.
I do. So,
then I'll ask another one then
Yes.
real quick. I'm originally from New Orleans, and I'm wondering that the huge tradition of St. Joseph altars there. Have you ever visited during St. Joseph's Day in New Orleans?
no, I haven't visited there, but my family and other parishioners and community members and we very much enjoy celebrating St. Joseph's Day on our own. So we don't set up any sort of altars at our particular parish, but yeah, we tend to come together and have some very large St. Joseph's Day meals.
In New Orleans, when I was a kid, it really takes over the town pretty much. And there used to be a classified ad heading in the newspaper that if you were having a St. Joseph altar, you would advertise your address in the newspaper, and total strangers would troop through your home and
Yeah.
take the cookies and the fava beans. Do you do the fava beans?
I haven't, but yes, these altars can get really incredible. Yeah, someone recently gave me an entire book on St. Joseph altars.
Yeah, they have some
and
beautiful. It's amazing. And
Yeah.
people cook for weeks in advance, and they set up these tables. And it's Sicilian immigrants from New Orleans that brought this custom there. And the idea was that the fava bean helped save them from famine back in Sicily. And so these are considered very important.
Yeah.
And so there are always fava beans on the altar, and the priest blesses them, and they're called lucky beans. And when you leave a St. Joseph altar, you get the free cookies and a holy card and lucky beans that if you keep them in your pocket, you'll never be without money as
Yes.
a customer or whatever. All right. You should visit sometime.
I should, absolutely, I would love to.
Great. Anybody else? Going, gone? Sarah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This has been fabulous. Okay, so we've got your website. Are you on Instagram or any other sort of social media
I'm just on
presence?
Twitter,
Okay.
but yeah, you can find that just by Googling me or going to my website.
Do
So
you have any classes coming up at the Newberry?
no,
Okay.
not yet. No.
All right, so you can check out our website, look for Newberry. Thank you all for coming, and just one closing thing, I think a prayer for peace would be appropriate with all that's going on. So why don't we just have a moment of silence, and I'll read you this prayer for peace before everybody can begin their day. For those who are fleeing, sanctuary. For those who are staying, safety. For those who are fighting, peace. For those whose hearts are breaking, comfort. For those who see no future, hope. So take those thoughts with you this afternoon, and have a blessed day, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.